Thank you so much for joining us for the second webinar of a series of conversations sponsored by the Academic Leadership Institute. My name is Jonathan Holloway. I'm president and university professor at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. The Academic Leadership Institute is a collaboration between Earl Lewis, the founding director of the Center for Social Solutions at the University of Michigan, and Dwight A. McBride, president of the New School. And forgive me for being a little bit informal, but I think it's important to know it's a collaboration between these two important leading scholars who also happen to be part of my academic network, mentors, and friends. This is an important element, although it seems informal for an introduction. It's really constitutive of what the Academic Leadership Institute, or OLLI, is all about. The OLLI will convene established and rising academic leaders over the course of these webinars and other opportunities for engagement to expose them to really important conversations when it comes to higher academic leadership, particularly as they relate to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. One of the things that will not really be news to those of you who have joined us here is that if we look in the world of higher education, the demographic changes facing the country are happening. The demographic makeup of our institutions of higher education are changing rapidly. And as I like to point out in my capacity as president, when I advocate for issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, people may think I'm advocating them for moral reasons. That's true. They may think I'm advocating for them for personal reasons. That's true too. But as president, I'm advocating for them for deeply pragmatic reasons. That if I want Rutgers to be well-positioned to be a leader in the world of higher education, we need to not be in the role of catching up in 3, 5, 7, 10 years to the changing landscape in this country. We need to be out in front now. This is what great institutions do. They anticipate changes and they get in place for them. Through OLLI, we are going to provide opportunities for academic leaders who have aspirations perhaps for further engagement, further climbing of their particular opportunity tree, learning from former presidents and provosts, current presidents, provosts as well, to where we can share our ideas, hopes, fears, challenges, our wisdom, such as we might have it, in a way that will help all of you understand better what may be coming your direction, and then when to actually take advantage of an opportunity. And going back to one of my very early statements, it is really about building a network of like-minded people, like-oriented people, so that we can make a substantive difference and be ready when we are called to take charge. So as I said before, my name is Jonathan Holloway. I'm the president at Rutgers University. I have, if I start from my first year of grad school, been in higher ed for 31 years now. Most of my career spent at Yale, where I finished up as dean of Yale College before moving to Northwestern, where I was provost for 3 years until moving to Rutgers, effectively starting July 1 of 2020. We are joined today. This is actually a very special treat for this session. We have 3 leaders in the world of higher ed joining us today who are going to be speaking on these important topics. Felix Matos Rodriguez has been Chancellor of the City University of New York, CUNY, since May 2019. He's the first educator of color and first Latino to head the nation's largest urban public university, serving over, and this is rather stunning, 270,000 degree-seeking students in 25 campuses across New York City's 5 boroughs. Dr. Matos Rodriguez's career spans both academia and in the public sector. He's a scholar, teacher, administrator, and former cabinet secretary for the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Chancellor Matos Rodriguez served as the president of Queens College from 2014 until his historic appointment, and was president of Hostos Community College from 2009 to 2014, making him one of the select few US educators to have been president of both a community and baccalaureate college. Born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, the Chancellor has a BA in Latin American Studies from Yale University and a PhD in History from Columbia University. Joining us in this conversation is Dr. Robert Sellers, who is the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, as well as the Charles D. Moody Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Professor of Education at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. He is responsible for overseeing the university's 5-year strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and serves as a principal advisor to the president as a member of the university's executive leadership team. Dr. Sellers works with the provost on matters related to diversity at the university, as well as a broad range of academic issues, including the budget, faculty tenure and promotions, and student enrollment. He oversees the operations of 3 central administrative units. He oversees operations of 3 central administrative units. He is a native of Cincinnati, Ohio, and attended Howard University, graduating cum laude with a Bachelor's of Science degree in psychology, earning his PhD in personality psychology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Sellers' primary research activities have focused on the role of race in the psychological lives of African Americans. He is also one of the founders of the Center for the Study of Black Youth in Context. We are also joined by Dr. Mariko Silver, who is the president and CEO of the Henry Luce Foundation. She was previously the president of Bennington College. During the Obama administration, she served for the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as acting assistant secretary and deputy assistant secretary for international policy. Dr. Silver also served for Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano as the policy advisor for economic development, innovation, and higher education. Prior to her government service, Dr. Silver was instrumental in the transformation and expansion of Arizona State University, leading teams in economic development policy and metrics, science, technology and innovation policy, state K-12 and higher education policy, sustainability science, and global health. Dr. Silver is a fellow of the National Academy of Public Administration and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She holds a PhD in economic geography from UCLA, a Master's of Science in Science and Technology Policy from SPRU, University of Sussex in the UK, and a BA in History from Yale University. This is quite a lineup for our session on budget, foe or friend when advancing a diversity agenda. As we start, I'm going to ask each of you to speak to the very first question, the same question. You have each 5 minutes to answer it, and thereafter, because we are academics who tend to go on, just like I have right now, I'll ask for crisp answers of 2 to 3 minutes in the follow-up questions. So the first question, and we'll just go in the order of introduction. The opening question that I want you to address is how has the pandemic affected your institutions financially?
So should I begin?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Jonathan. Great to be here with Robert and Mariko too. Thank you for the invite, Errol and Doug. You know, the pandemic has been brutal to New York City, and as an institution that depends both on state and city funds, the loss of funding over the last year or so will be between 250 million and maybe 400 million, depending on who we're counting, and we're finalizing our budget right now. So the usual that many of the institutions who are here represented have felt: loss of enrollment, loss of funding from the state and the city, costs that we were not budgeted for in terms of things that we needed to purchase to deal with the pandemic, from PPE to additional laptops to support our students when we move to online transition. So, I mean, quite substantial loss, and the concern about how the city and the state budget will continue in the next year and the next couple of years is something that's very much in my mind. I would like to add one thing. Is the economic decline on effect on our students. 40% of our students became unemployed. I mean, the sectors where many of our students, many of them work, retail, hospitality, were decimated by the pandemic, right? So it's not just the loss of revenue to the institution, it's also the economic impact on the lives of our students that has a direct repercussion on the work that we do and that we can do. And the last thing that I'll say about finances is, which I think is a topic for this group, is uncertainty. I mean, one of the biggest challenges has been to not exactly know what's coming at the end, right? In terms of being able, if you had a financial hit, but you had a sense of what's coming after, you plan, you adapt, but the uncertainty has been one of the things that has been so difficult to navigate financially. It has affected also conversations that are associated with trust, with our labor, with our stakeholders, I mean, all those things. The fact that there's a lot of things that we don't know and we cannot answer, and we need to move ahead with that. So I want to put that, that's not dollars and cents, but that has a direct impact on the work that we do.
Thank you so much. And I'm really glad you raised that. And I'm going to come to you next, Rob, so just hang on one second. But I'm really glad you raised that point, because while this is a session that by title is really talking about budget, we all know that money and psychology and personal sense of comfort, these are all deeply intertwined with one another. And I'll let Rob go next, but then, well, we'll see how this, hopefully this will turn into a real conversation, and I may be an active interlocutor as we go forward. So Rob, please continue.
Perfect.
No, I would absolutely, well, first I want to thank you, Dwight, and Earl for the opportunity to be here and be on a great panel with Felix and Mariko. I'm not sure that I would have much of a different perspective in terms of what's happening at Michigan. So I think the biggest issue is really the issue of we don't know what's at the end of this. It's the uncertainty that makes things most difficult. It has also, from a psychological perspective, it's uncertainty in a space of uncertainty as a nation, which leads to fear, a lack of trust. Lots of the things that you traditionally look to intervene with regards to fear and trust are things that we can't do. So connecting interpersonally, being able to enact our social support networks at an individual level, which has bred a great deal of distrust on our campus. I guess I keep coming back to the word of distrust.
Yep.
So from an administrative perspective, we've found ourselves both financially, but also operationally, dealing with a problem for which none of us have ever had to deal with, and for which each day you get new information, sometimes consistent, sometimes very inconsistent of what you heard about before. And the nature, the length, the extent of the problem looks very different literally on a day-to-day basis. So with that in mind, it's also very difficult to plan with regards to the financial situation. And so there's cases where we've had to be particularly cautious. And for us, there is some good news that at least in terms of the initial reactions with regards to state funding, the hit hasn't been as bad as we had initially feared, but there's still downstream consequences. And the other side of that, and I think this is really telling, is that the fact that it hasn't been so bad is primarily due to the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on the poorest folks, the least financially well folks in our country. And given the fact that much of our state budget, when we look at it, is derived from those who are at the highest end of the income stream, in some ways we've been, as a state, buffered by that impact. But the flip side of that is the need side, in terms of when we start figuring out what are the costs of the services that we need to provide, that's where the long-term impact is really going to play out.
Yeah, that's an excellent point on long-term impact. I'm on the New Jersey Recovery and Restart Commission, the governor's commission, to get the state back up and running. And the virus, as we know, has revealed things that many of us have known for quite some time, but now there's no hiding from the fact about disparate impact, health outcomes, et cetera. It was shocking, though, even being aware of this phenomenon, to see the extent of the disparity in the case of New Jersey, which is a quite wealthy state, actually, but the disparity is shocking. and that certainly has an effect on how universities, it's affecting universities too.
Exactly.
Because our students reflect that kind of
Mhm.
financial diversity also. Marco, to you, the same question.
Sure. Well, it will come as no surprise to anyone on this webinar that foundations are just fine. So from the point of view of foundations, and I won't speak to my former institutions, but I know very much from being in that seat very recently how hard it is, both the uncertainty of it and the reality of it. The inability to model, the inability to extrapolate, the constant stress that that creates on everyone. And as you said, Robert, the inability to re-knit those relationships when there is a rupture is incredibly stressful on the individuals, the community, and the institutional infrastructure. And I know we're going to get to institutional infrastructure. So from the foundation point of view, the big shift for, as I'm sure many of you are aware, a lot of foundations is something that I hope will sustain post-pandemic, which is a willingness and interest in supporting that kind of infrastructural work and not just project-based work. Where can we fund things that, even if they are project-based, are actually engaging those infrastructural and systemic issues, not just the project itself? So thinking about program design, project design in new ways, encouraging grantees to use the power that our money can sometimes convey, though there are things that money can't do, but the levers that sometimes external money can provide to make those systemic and structural changes. And I hope that will continue. And just to say, I think, certainly from our point of view, and then also I think many of my colleagues in foundations' point of view, that the work of rebuilding is real and will take time. And the work of rethinking and reimagining who we want to be next, not we foundations, but we as a society want to be next. What's the 10-year plan we want to start planting for now, even as we have to survive those 10 years, trying to think on those parallel tracks and support all of you to think on those parallel tracks and work on those parallel tracks, I think has been a significant shift in just the mindset of foundations.
That's very helpful to sort of point. I want to layer in a bit of something what you were saying, is that so much of budget is planning, right? And I've been in private institutions until coming to Rutgers. And so I'm now exposed to a very different notion of how budget is built. It's a little uncomfortable to have it not in my own institutional control, but that is the way it goes. But when I think about from a university administrator's planning perspective, is that our job is to think 3, 5, and 10 years down the road, of course. And going back to my opening statement about Ollie, is that this institute is built with the awareness that demography of the country is changing, the importance of diversity as a strategic factor in the success of institutions is becoming more and more evident to people. Although I'm sure I'm in some sort of bubble in that way, but I do think if for nothing else, people want to avoid terrifying crises, as they saw in the moment of racial reckoning laid bare last year. So in thinking of planning, what is the role, and I'll start with Rob first. We'll just sort of shift who goes first. Rob, then Mariko, then, well, we'll just be a conversation at that point. But what is the role of diversity in that planning in these uncertain budget times?
So I think in your opening comment with regards to framing why diversity is important is so key. Too often diversity has been thought about as a moral imperative or even a socially just imperative. And again, like you, I agree with all of those. But the challenge is when you come to financially difficult situations, all of those things, other things become a luxury you can't afford. So if diversity is not fundamental to the mission of your institution and thought of not as an add-on, but as core part of the DNA of everything that you do, then it's at risk for being lopped off or sacrificed for the sake of fiscal survival. So I would argue diversity has to be fundamental to everything that you're doing, because everything that you do as an institution plays out differently depending on where you're coming from in this society. And we all come from different places and different spaces, and we all have something to contribute, but the impact of it is going to look very different. It's going to look very different if you're coming from inner city Detroit with relatively fewer financial resources than if you're coming 10 miles outside of the city from, say, Grosse Pointe with a great deal of financial resources, with access and opportunity, both educational, social, health, et cetera. So if I'm trying to provide and think about the overall well-being of my students, that's going to look different depending on where they're at. So a plan to address mental health of our students, which is a major issue, has to be a plan that recognizes the breadth of experiences that our students bring to the table. A plan that is focused on raising funds from a development perspective can't simply be based on a notion that we're going to go after a few rich white guys and get their funding, and that's the way in which we're going to get by. You have to be able to understand the breadth and totality of not only who you're serving, but also opportunities, and opportunities to solve problems that you otherwise wouldn't if your vision of your institution, your vision of the problem isn't framed from a diversity, and I would also include equity and inclusion perspective. You're going to end up losing. So DEI is fundamental not only to your survival, but more important as an institution to your thriving.
Thank you. So Mariko, I know that you're at the Luce Foundation. You're very recently at Bennington College, and I'm not trying to get you to tell stories that are out of turn, but you were operating in a very small environment in when I think of Bennington, I think of a homogenous environment. And I don't know if I'm correct. You can explain that to me or not. But in thinking about small liberal arts colleges, especially those that exist in fairly homogenous places, how do we tell the story of the importance of DEI as of strategic importance when we can't, quote, see it?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, I would say a couple of things. For telling stories out of schools for when we're together in person, so we can save that. It's one of the reasons why we get together in person. But I would say, my starting point is twofold. Right? You're talking about, I assume when you say homogeneous environment, you're talking about the Vermont, the rural environment.
Yeah.
My experience of that is actually that there is no such thing as a homogeneous environment. It doesn't exist. So that as a premise, right, when we think about, for example, even thinking about other countries and where, they're able to put forward social welfare systems, et cetera, sometimes the reason that's given that they're able to do it and another country or another place is not able to do it is because they're homogenous. But in fact, they are not. Right? For all of us who've been to some of those places, they're not homogenous. They might have some shared values, they might have some shared experiences, but they're not homogenous. So if you start from the point of view that there's no such thing as a homogenous environment, then you design differently in the first place. And certainly in the United States, there's no such thing as a homogenous environment. Anybody who has friends and family anywhere, right? Family who are literally like from the same tree, that is not a homogenous environment. So I think if we start from the point of view that there is no such thing, then we design differently. That having been said, we also know that people do bring in-group and out-group kinds of experiences with them. And one of the conversations that we had a lot, not just at Bennington, but among groups of colleges, was thinking about the ways in which we have embedded assumptions about certain kinds of not just race, but also class awareness or ideas about what's proper or appropriate, or even what people want out of college. And how do we start with engaging the students directly rather than engaging our ideas about who they ought to become? Engage them in the conversation about who they want to become. And that if you start there, you come up with, again, very different kinds of designs. So I would say that. At the same time, I would affiliate myself with everything that you and Robert just said about the need to change those institutions. It was not until I was a college president that I heard from students, this is a historically white institution. I was like, oh, I never heard that before. Not about, and I never heard about any institution. I know I'm talking about it roughly 10 years ago, or a little bit less. And I thought, okay, well, what does that mean? What does that mean we need to change? Because of course it is a historically white institution. How would we rethink what we're about and who we're for? And at Bennington, I think we were very fortunate that it's inherently a student-centered place. That having been said, I still did say multiple times to multiple different constituencies, if we do not diversify the faculty and the staff, we will become irrelevant and no one will miss us. And you just have to be real about that.
I'm sorry, did I cut you off?
No.
No.
Go ahead.
No, that's a powerful concluding thought about, because universities and colleges, especially in our very fraught political narrative moment, I find that we have to demonstrate our relevance over and over and over again. Even though from my perspective, speaking from inside the industry, our relevance is pretty dang obvious. I mean, our value proposition is pretty obvious, but we are not successfully telling that story. Felix, I'm going to turn it to you. You oversee a massive system with many different types of institutions. I mean, for people who can't really, I'm working off of a small screen. My screen just says Rutgers behind it. That's pretty simple, even though I know it's a complex. You've got all these different types of institutions behind you. So how do you, in thinking of, really coming back to our topic, our core topic, budget, pandemic, diversity, planning, how do you execute on a plan that recognizes the fluidity of this moment, that recognizes the kinds of narratives that Mariko was just talking about, self-authored narratives of what a place is, and then what relevance will look like 17 years down the line, and recognizing as well that what Rob was talking about, the diversity being expressed in lots of different ways, and we need to be attuned to that too. It's a lot. It's a lot, but you're the head of a big place. You can handle the answer.
Well, thank you for that. It is true, and I think that the fact that I been a faculty member, sort of, been in the institution. I came to CUNY to teach at Hunter, and then had the opportunity to be president of a community college in one of our four-year schools. I think that also it's helpful to me in thinking about the diversity of our 24 campuses that go from two-year schools to professional schools. So you latch on to 2, 3, 4 large themes system-wide, and then you see how they play out in each one of the campuses, and then you allow that campus also to shine with their own sense of identity and mission, which has its own history. So that's the balance that I always try to operate under as the chancellor, which is also work in progress. I've been in the job for less than 2 years, but things that are common. Going back to budgets, we made a budget request to the state. We knew that it was a very difficult time in the state and the city. And we wanted to say the things that we thought we needed to do the kind of job that we want to do, both for our students, but also as a key force in making sure that the city's going to get back on its feet, right? So it goes back to that point you made about the value proposition, right? New York City is not going to get back to be a formidable economic, social community space unless CUNY plays a key role in making that happen, right? So that's very much important in the sense of investing in what we do to get to the recovery in an equitable way that everybody wants. So our budget request spoke to things that were associated with that recovery, spoke to things that were beneficial to our students in their career engagement and the opportunities they were going to have, spoke to some public policy issues around public health, in which we were key and are still important as we get out of the pandemic. But one of the things that we made, going back to this, and all those things touch upon diversity and inclusion, right? I can go into how each one of those things plays out. But one of the things we also did, we're very intentional. Our request for new faculty zero on diverse faculty. We made the very request, and we are very, very cautious in not asking for a whole range of things, knowing the state of the finances of the city and the state. But we were very instrumental in sending that signal. As a chancellor, one of the things that I feel this year, I hired 11 new presidents, 9 full, two interns, right? So you signal that. The things that you control, you signal to the system what's important. In that group, of the 9, 6 presidents of color, half of them women, right? And also diversity writ large. Many of them also first-time, college goers in their own generation, which speaks very highly to our community college population. A balance also on disciplines, artists, scientists, lawyers, educators, right? In those choices, I signal to the system what the system should be looking for in terms of diversity, and then help those presidents in their campuses, right, to advance that agenda themselves. But clearly, I made the point that in the items that are directly under my control, which is the budget presentation, what are the values that are there, in the selection of the teams that I pick, in the central office, there is no more, it's a cabinet of 13, and we have 8 persons of color. The first time there was an Asian American in the cabinet, which is crazy given that we're in New York City and New York. Of my 11 new presidents, the first time an Asian American selected as president, and actually we got 2 at Baruch and at Queens, right? So again and again, trying to say there's all this phenomenal talent, there's this agenda of excellence, and from the get-go, you signal that those things are important. Nobody can come and then say, you on the things that you immediately control, you're not, sort of walking the talk. And I think that that's a very important thing in what we do. And that's what I try to do in what has been a very challenging year, because it's been very responsive to the COVID situation, at least on the budget and on the hires that we do. And when we talk about budget, right, 75% of all our budgets are people.
Mm-hmm.
And we cannot forget that, right? And diversity is really about, and we are institutions in which our missions are people, right? So using the budget as an excuse not to advance these things, it just doesn't jive with me, because you're being inconsistent.
That's a great point. I looked across the screen immediately after the words come out of your mouth. I've hired 9 presidents in the last year, and sort of the shock that we're all going through. That's quite something. But it does speak to a very important point that I hadn't thought that we'd be making right now. But this is what's great about live TV, folks, is that what you're talking about is like who's in the room, and it matters. It deeply matters.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to get to it, and this is a question, whoever wants to answer it. And I'm going to be provocative intentionally, okay? Devil's advocate intentionally. You were talking about, Felix, the diversity of the people who are now in these positions of leadership, and this hadn't happened before. Okay, they look a certain way, they have a certain set of values, but the person who's really managing the money at these institutions, the chief financial officer. And to what extent, this is again for any of you who care to answer, how does the CFO, I mean, we're just talking numbers here, folks, just talking numbers. Where does the CFO come into a diversity conversation, an equity conversation?
Well, I mean, the CFO gets hired by me. Right? So, I mean, when I saw that question, I think that that's a more complicated conversation if you're in a different place in the hierarchy, right? When I saw that question there, I said, when you, this is, the CFO better be in sync, right? Or the CFO is going to become a candidate looking for a job elsewhere. I mean, very, very candidly, right? Obviously, these things, I think the challenge is when things start getting operationalized down the chain, right? Yeah. That's when the values begin to get lost, because then everybody starts going for what normally you have received, and all those other the what I call the institutional culture begins to sink in. And that's where you have to really push in. And that's why you also, part of my expectations to the team is, when we talk in higher ed about diversity, we normally go to student body or faculty, right? And we don't talk about staff. which are part of the permanent government in the public institutions too. And I've charged my team, I said, part of this is the same efforts we're doing in faculty. You need to look down the line in the rest of your teams. Yeah. I mean, at the central office, for example, we have over 25 lawyers. And there was 2 or 3 lawyers of color in New York City. Unacceptable, right? So part of my challenge to the team is that, and I think the publics have a particularly higher bar in terms of representing the constituents that we serve, right? And I feel and that, you know, in this conversation, we have to have nuances about the kinds of institutions. In the publics, I think that is a very high bar, but it cuts across not just faculty and students. It has to be across the entire system. And when you have more of those people around, it becomes easier to then have the conversations and the follow-up and the action and the change.
That's great. We're going to go to breakout sessions in a couple of moments, but I want to ask, I mean, none of these questions are small, but I'm going to ask for short answers. So Rob, I know that you head up diversity, equity, inclusion at University of Michigan. And I know from having studied what you've done, I mean, this is a monumental effort by the university. Thinking of the notion of staff down the line in the operational space, and how do you, as the head of the DEI effort, how are you interacting with the financial operations of the institution? To what extent does culture get played into this, et cetera?
So we've purposefully made DEI. So while I am the chief diversity officer and the CFO is a chief financial officer, everybody has a fiscal responsibility. And so we want everyone to have a diversity, equity, and inclusion responsibility. So in every aspect of the university, just as we all have the responsibility to manage university funds in a way that are fiscally responsible, everyone should also be managing their units in ways that promote diversity, provide climates, structures that are equitable, and being inclusive. That it's not that DEI is, again, sort of a separate thing. It is fundamental to all aspects of the university. And the one thing that I would also add in terms of our chief financial officer, so they've worked very hard, and we've to try to as service and our contracts with other aspects of the state, that's every bit as important as the scholarship that we produce, the teaching that we do. And it tells us if we're not diverse, equitable, and inclusive in those spaces, then we've also failed. And the other thing is, for the chief financial officer, at least at Michigan, what's even more important than the chief financial officer is the chief budget officer. Because our chief financial officer's job is to get money. It's our chief budgeter's officer's responsibility to determine where we're spending the money. And that's the key piece to determining whether or not we're actually going to fulfill our mission as an institution.
It reminds the classic line, follow the money, doesn't it?
Follow the money.
No, but for the tech folks who are going to send us out to the breakout session, just bear with me for 2 more minutes. Mariko, this is the last question to you for this particular phase of the program. You started out by the very first answer you provided talking about planning. Now, from the standpoint of the foundation world, and that you are, as I understand it, a partner to people who are applying to you, to helping them shape their plans. That's my understanding. So how thinking out 3 to 5 years, I mean, what is the role of DEI in planning for that new way of being? I don't know what the right phrase is right now.
Yeah. So before I get to that, if I could, I just want to echo what Felix and Rob said, which is that the CFO or CBO, if that's the structure that you have, to me, when I was a college president, is the unsung hero of institutional change. Because this is a leadership program, I just want to say that so clearly. It was not something that was apparent to me, I will say, before I became a president. And it was so apparent to me once I became a president. And a good partner in a CFO makes the world of difference in terms of what you're able to do. And I think that's true regardless of institutional type, and I think that's regardless of institutional mission. So just from the leadership development point of view, I just cannot say that strongly enough. And
Yes.
the person that we had at Bennington that was the most important hire, and he's just fantastic, because those people in that role can be incredibly creative and on board and in it with you, or they cannot. And it will absolutely make or break your agenda. No question.
I echo that, absolutely. Yes.
So on that point, I think, from the foundation point of view, actually a related point, which is that I think we tend to, for foundations that have traditionally been project-based as opposed to supporting institutions with general operating funds. And the vast majority, I think, of old school or traditional foundations, institutional foundations, as opposed to relatively new foundations with living donors who might be giving, for example, to their alma mater. Right? The vast majority of foundations are project-based in their giving for the most part, or have traditionally been so, though some of that is shifting. Particularly when they're giving to colleges, universities, right? The age of giving to, just giving a sort of broad-based gift to university is, for the most part, past for most institutional foundations. And so then the question becomes for us, what kinds of conversations are we going to get into with institutions? I think if you kind of, back, often it would be with a particular faculty member or a particular, maybe a chair, but we really need to engage the institutions, understand what the institutional planning looks like. In some cases, there's a whole motorcycle activity that happens near my apartment, and I don't even have a campus anymore. So I'll have a nice backdrop, virtual background. I got motorcycle gangs outside, just like my kids will be here any minute. Sorry. But not on the motorcycles. So I think it's incumbent upon us as foundations to understand the larger plan of the institutions. And I think that is also, to your first question, one of the shifts that has happened, let's just say at our foundation, that it's become much clearer, I think, over the course of the pandemic, that we need to be engaged with understanding what is the long-term planning, right? If we're going to fund a project with fund a faculty member for 3 years, is the institution really going to pick up that line 3 years from now? What kind of commitment is there in the institution to the kinds of things that we're trying to seed? Because otherwise we can seed and seed and seed and seed, but the ground is not fertile. So we really have to figure out and be in conversation with the administration, which I think historically some foundations, not all, but some foundations have said, well, that's not our business. We fund the intellectual work. Mm-hmm. But the intellectual work is contingent upon the institutional work. You cannot separate the two. And I think for too long we've separated the two.
That's great. Thank you so much. There's a ton for us to think about right now. I want to, before we go to breakout sessions, and there'll be, this is being handled on the tech side of the house. I think we're all familiar about being bumped into breakout sessions, just hang in there. I want to remind everybody that we are living in a complicated age, and certainly at Rutgers, we've been dealing with Zoom bombing and things like that, and bad behavior. I'll just simply ask that I know all of you are beautifully behaved individuals, but please, in the breakout session, let's have this be as constructive as possible. I think it's just an important thing to acknowledge and say as we go forward. So we're going to head into the breakout session to really afford everybody the opportunity to have an extended conversation about some of these key themes that have come up, whether it's planning, whether it's institutional partnerships, whether it's psychology, whether it is, depending on your institutions, state versus private funding, maybe where you sit in your particular institution is 2 steps away from university leadership. And what does that mean if you're 4 steps away? I mean, I think they do mean different things. So these are all things that I think would be really helpful to have in the conversation. The breakouts will run till a little bit after 2 o'clock. You'll receive prompts about that. And then we'll have Dwight McBride, my friend, president at the New School, help usher into the next phase of the conversation where we can get into a Q&A for everybody. So with that, Tech, take us away, please. I think we're all back now. Yeah, so in your particular breakout room, Felix, you were cut off at the last minute. In our breakout room, we were cut off in mid-sentence as well, which is, I guess, is a good sign, because we could have kept going, and I hope that was an experience shared in all the different breakout rooms. But now we're all back together, and as I said before, Dwight McBride, president of the New School and founder, co-envisionating person for Ollie, is here to gather up the questions and really get a large democratizing moment for today's webinar. So Dwight, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thanks to our panelists and for all of our participants today. I am trying to take as many of the questions that have come in. Some are very similar, and I'm going to cast them together and maybe ask our panelists to give brief responses so we can get through as many of them as possible. I want to start with one that's a bit wide-ranging, and I think hits on a number of the issues that folks have raised. And also, if anyone has other questions, I should have said, please drop them in the chat. Victoria is collecting those and forwarding them to me so that we can make sure I am seeing what's coming in. We're all accustomed, and this is for everyone on the panel, to working in an environment in which we have good data, to inform our decision-making on strategy, on allocation of resources. That has not been the case during this pandemic. We are dealing with unprecedented times, unprecedented moments. Certainly a lot of the data that we normally rely on about things like enrollment numbers, et cetera, just aren't useful in this era of unpredictability and uncertainty. What have you learned in this pandemic about leading in a time of uncertainty and ambiguity? And what lessons from that will you carry forward?
I could just say, I mean, I'm obviously not leading a college or university at the moment, but one of the things, and this is a little bit of a carry forward from our breakout session, I think there is a real opportunity in the uncertainty to try to clarify, at least with the leadership team or with whatever the core group is that's relevant to you, what are we really afraid of and what are we really trying to do? And I know it sounds really simple and straightforward, but those are not the kinds of questions that mostly get asked in the day-to-day. But are there opportunities to try to kind of separate out what is it that we're really afraid of and what is it that we're really trying to accomplish, so that when things come back to whatever future normal looks like, we don't lose track of those things that we did learn because we were in this sort of heightened emotional state for the course of 2020 into 2021.
Thank you, Marco.
I think one of the biggest lessons that was learned here, at least I hope we've learned it at the University of Michigan, is the I in DEI and being inclusive. So in many ways, as university leadership, we often come from a faculty mentality of problem solving, where we try to get as much information and try to make the best decisions in the context of multiple pieces of information. Bring as many folks around the table to try to solve the problem. And with the notion that ultimately the best solution is the best outcome. And not recognizing the fact that the best solution by definition has to be inclusive. So our job isn't to come up with just the best solution and then impose it on the larger community, even if it is the very best solution. It has to also include opportunities to interact and engage the larger solution, the larger community, so that they feel like that solution is their solution as well. Because no matter how right a solution may be in terms of objective factors, it still is imposed if one is not participating in that particular process. And there's going to be natural reactions against that solution, even though that same solution might have been the exact same thing if everyone was included in the process in some way. You're going to end up with very different outcomes and very different success. And so that I, which often gets sort of lost in the DEI discussion, really does play out in really important ways, addressing basically any institutional challenge and problem that affects the larger community.
Mm-hmm. Belo, I heard you wanted to get in there too.
Well, I mean, just two quick things. I think humility. I mean, we have been First, I mean, a sense of powerlessness, which is very frustrating and difficult, and I think particularly difficult in the roles that we play, because of the many things that we do not control, that we don't know, that keep changing. And then, which I think it might be sort of interesting that we are in a diversity sort of space, is the diversity in the capacity to tolerate and think about risk. I mean, that is at the bottom line many of the things that affect what we do, right? How safe I feel I am, or I can be, or I will be, and how is that different from you, and what is the risk that you might be able to tolerate and be comfortable, and ones that you may not be, and that's an extremely personable thing that needs to then, going back to Robert's point, be part of a conversation, be part of a process that leads to, sort of collective conclusions, but incredible humility.
Our next question is from a colleague at CUNY, and it's what parts of university expenditures are maintained or expended in a time, or expanded, I'm sorry, during times of crisis, and what parts are trimmed, and how do you approach making those decisions? I think if I were translating that to the world that Mariko is in, I'd ask, surely, there are plans that she and her colleagues had both at Luce and other foundations pre-COVID, that with the onslaught of the pandemic and the way in which that crisis has changed and reordered many of our priorities, what has that meant for people like you in the foundation world in terms of approaching your allocation of resources as well?
So I'll just give a very brief answer, which is to say that it has made very clear that it's absolutely required that we rethink significantly the way that we allocate resources, also what we ask for from those to whom we do make grants, what we ask for in terms of what we want on the front end, and then the kind of reporting that we do. I mean, I think you're seeing this across a range of philanthropies that realize that they have in the spirit of rigor created make work. And we need to rethink that. And we need to rethink what we're asking about who is part of various different projects. And again, back to that earlier piece about really reimagining and encouraging our grantees to use our support as an opportunity to reimagine things that they want to reimagine rather than to please us.
Well, I think that's probably, we're in budget season at CUNY, so I imagine that part of that question has a lobbying effort there too, and happy to take that on. And nobody was assuming an economic downturn in New York City that would lead to the kinds of fallout that we had. So choices we made this year were about protecting the core of the institution, and that meant trying to protect as many of our staff members and keep the operation going. We had to do some very painful things, a furlough, 5 days for all the administrators. There were some raises in the contract that we had with our union that we had to put the brakes on because we didn't quite know whether we were going to have the money to pay moving forward, and we intend to pay that, and it's part of our lobbying efforts now as we go. But that's been one of the things that has been difficult about the uncertainty, that we have to make difficult decisions because there's things about the here and now that need to be addressed, and you need to do them to protect the larger institution. And we've been very fortunate that we didn't have to do any layoffs of full-time personnel, like in maybe some of the spaces in higher ed. And so it's been a very, very difficult year, and one that nobody was planning for. So I think that we've done the very best to provide, keep the academic momentum of our students going, mostly online, keep our staff and personnel and community safe, and then make a case now to our elected officials in a very difficult budget year about what are the key things that we need to be part of the recovery, as I mentioned before, but also keep our engines going.
Rob, did you want in on this one?
Yeah, I think that we have an opportunity here. And I want to build on both Mariko and Felix's comments. From a DEI space, we have been working in my capacity at the university to try to make the University of Michigan have DEI be a core part of its DNA. And I keep going back to that. And in doing so, we're trying to retrofit. This is an institution that's been around for 200 years, that was designed not for a whole lot of the people that are here. It was not designed for them, it was explicitly designed not for them. And it has a very successful history in that context. And so what we're trying to do is change that institution to fit a broader view of what's actually happening in the world now and in the future. But we're often trying to redesign. So we're, in a way of thinking about it, is we're trying to add ramps to some very old buildings. But we're going to have to build a new university. And the universities that are going to survive and thrive after this can't look the same that they did beforehand. And there's an opportunity to put DEI at the core of what that new vision of higher education, and in our case, the University of Michigan, is going to look like. It may mean that we have buildings with no stairs. All of them are ramps, because if they're all ramps, it can be accessible to everyone. And the ramps aren't an add-on. And so as we think about how we deliver a curriculum, how we recruit students, how we engage with communities, how we think about the production of knowledge, we have an opportunity to rethink that and to do so in a way that is much broader than the ways in which we had originally thought about it as we were designing and creating and evolving our institutions. We have an opportunity to have a broader vision that will ultimately be more effective to our mission by fully engaging and fully taking advantage of the breadth of human talent, by engaging the breadth of the human experience, by engaging the breadth of the human challenges and problems that we face as society, that we say is fundamental to why we as institutions of higher education actually exist. And so from that perspective, I think the institutions that get it right now in thinking about the future versus trying to figure out how they're going to get back to what they were are going to be the ones that are going to be most successful in the future. And those that still look at what it was and not including a broader sense of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means in it are going to be at an extreme competitive disadvantage. And so as leaders, I think there's an opportunity for us to push that perspective, to push and make change that, quite frankly, might have taken much longer, if ever, without the situation. So that's my glass half full vision of the pandemic.
I want to follow that up with a very practical question, but that it's going to probably draw you into a little bit of the philosophical. And that is, this last year has been a challenge for all of us, in whatever institution you are, wherever you sit in the institution. Our attention has been demanded on a variety of different problems and fires that we need to put out, issues that come up and arise as a result of not only the pandemic, but much of the other kind of unrest, some of the racial unrest that has manifested itself in the country, and racial reckoning that I think has been really important. In a variety of ways, our attention has been demanded on a variety of issues. How do you just practically work to stay focused on what are also in the midst of all of this crisis, to speak to Rob's last, those opportunities for the future? And that's the hard thing about leadership, for me, at least in this moment, is making sure that we're not missing out on those opportunities, even in the midst of crisis. How do you do that? How do you practically organize yourself in a way that keeps that happening?
I'll give you a practical example. So we have just announced a effort to hire 20 new faculty in the context of our anti-racism initiative. In addition, we are moving forward, like many institutions, looking to increase the number of faculty in our health sciences, responding to a RFA from NIH. We have had the capacity and the capability and processes to do that in the past, in terms of our Provost Faculty Initiative Program. But by framing it this way, we've gotten much more uptake and energy in the context of the current moment around these initiatives to diversify faculty. So at one level, there's a part of me that's like, we've been trying to tell people to do this for a very long time, and we could, but now all of a sudden we have momentum to do some things that we couldn't have, or that we weren't willing to do in the past. And so there's the old adage of never let a good crisis go to waste. And so there's an opportunity for real movement in certain spaces as a function of what a cynic might say is a momentary sense of wokeness. But in the long run, if you look at what that change will actually mean, doesn't really matter how you got to that point in the long sense. It is a set of actions in a space of a place at a time in which we have faculty freezes in hiring as an institution. So it's an opportunity as an institution to say, this is where our values are, and really values is nothing more than prioritizing decisions. If you do something that doesn't cost you anything in terms of other decisions or constraints, then it's not really a value. You're acting on an opportunity or something that is free. But if you really are talking about a value, then you have to make choices, and you're willing to prioritize something over something else. So I think the way that we utilize these moments of budgetary crisis in particular to determine how we're actually spending what we can spend is really telling.
And I'll add just two quick things. It's been for us a chance. There's two in the bucket of priorities that I had. One is pedagogy, right, as part of student success, which we don't talk much in higher ed. And I love that because of the conversion to online and the concern about where students learning there. There's all this interest in pedagogy. I'm like, you were not that interested in that when it was face-to-face, and there was some pretty a lot of mediocrity there too, right? So I'm delighted that the move to the more online has led to a deeper conversation on pedagogy and how we learn and how we can, do what our faculty I know wants to do, which is at the best tools at their disposal to teach it the best way possible, that we don't always do that in the graduate training. So that was a big emphasis that just the pandemic gave the opportunity to just really enhance it in ways that I think are going to be transformational for us down the line. and then also the engagement with some of the employers in New York City. This is tied up to the pandemic and also to the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of desire for the very diverse talent that probably only some of the, well, I have Doug here, but let me be kind about New York, but the diversity that we have in our institutions that they're looking for, and has led to really great partnerships. That was a priority and that just got put on steroids because of those things. So, and they're going to be really instrumental in helping the city get back on its feet here in New York. So two things that the crisis in some way helped us advance things that we were very interested in.
Mariko, did you want to get in on that? Yeah, I saw you unmuting.
Sure, and sorry for the ambulance, whatever that is. But I would say a couple of things just quickly. I think one is there are opportunities embedded here to shift people's risk frame, right? People's idea of risk, whether that's our board, that's faculty, that's other actors out in the world. That may look a little bit different at every institution, but to shift not just the risk frontier, like let's do things that are more risky, but what counts as risky, right? What counts as the edge? And how do we look at that? I think there are real opportunities there. And then just picking up on what Rob said, I think there are the things that that many of you on this webinar have long been ready and kind of waiting to do, like run in and do those, absolutely. And what needs to be teed up again for that 3, 5, 10 years from now, right? So that's where like come to us as foundations to say, okay, like we pushed through the portal of possibility, right? And now we're here and we need to set up for the next one. Hopefully it's not a horrible crisis, but actually a kind of evolutionary opportunity. And these are real opportunities to move out of the kind of incrementalist frame and really come to those of us who are funders to help make that possible for institutions and to help make that possible for ways of thinking about what institutions are for.
Thank you, Marika. And I guess we'll have to leave it there. There was one more question I was hoping to get in, but we'll have to save it for the next time. I'm going to turn it back over to my friend and colleague, Jonathan Holloway, to close us out today.
Thanks, Dwight. Pardon me. We are now really at time, so I'm going to ask the panelists to do something impossible. Give us like a few keywords. Keep it to 15 to 30 seconds about, what are key things for us to be thinking about in terms of this is a learning opportunity. What can our panelists, what can our audience take with them going forward? Rob, you're the first person I saw. I'm just going to jump to you.
Understand your budget and link diversity, equity, and inclusion to it. If you don't know where the money is and how it's spent, then it'll be very difficult for you to move things forward.
Well done. Mariko.
Can I just say what Rob said? Is that fast enough for you?
Yes, you can. I mean, it was a pretty sound answer, I must say. Felix?
I would say lead by example and make sure that in these tough times, you make a couple of short wins that will pave the road to lasting change.
Really quite beautiful. Thank you all so much. Thank everybody, the panelists, of course, the audience, the technicians, the OLLI colleagues. You've all made this, the time has flown by, and I know we all could spend a lot more time talking about this in this session, in the breakout rooms, and introductory session. For that reason, the sort of pent-up demand to talk about these things, I'm pleased to announce the launch of the inaugural residential program in August 2021 in Swarthmore College, Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, for the first residential component of this new OLLI initiative. I'm proud to be part of it and really glad that I was blessed to be part of Earl's and Dwight's network and now part of your network in order to make our higher education orbit better, more reflective, more capable in the future. Thanks so much for coming, and stay safe out there.
Thank you, Jonathan.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
everyone on is supposed to be on.
Well done, everybody. The tech, this was